Hingað kominn Timothy Snyder, hann bandarískur háskólaprófessor kominn hérna til að halda erindi á bókmenntahátíð í Reykjavík. Hann prófessor við Yale, hann hefur skrifað bækur 20. öldina, aðalega árin í kringum heimsstyrjöldina, en núna má segja frægust bókin sem heitir On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, bók sem hann skrifar svona í kjölfarið á kosningasigri Trumps í Bandaríkjunum. Welcome to this program, Timothy Snyder. On Tyranny, it's about ways to defeat authoritarianism. Be aware of authoritarianism and, well, recognize it. Isn't that sort of the gist of the book?
The book starts by trying to remind Americans that they are inside history and that things that Americans don't think are possible are in fact possible. So what I do is I remind Americans of all the history that we once knew but have forgotten from the European 20th century and try to explain how regimes change and then suggest 20 ways to try to prevent regime change, to try to preserve the institutions that we have. So the book is a response to a particular moment, the election of Donald Trump, of course, but I'm bringing to bear everything I think I understand as a historian about the 20th century.
You're mostly drawing lessons from the 30s, right? From the European history of the 30s, and well, making parallels into the modern condition.
The 1930s are a very interesting time. For one thing, it's the moment of the collapse of the first globalization. We think that the globalization we are in is new and unique, but we actually went through a rather similar pattern in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that globalization collapsed with the Great War, the Great Depression, and then the Second World War. So if we want to know how globalization collapses, the 1930s are a very useful time. The 1930s are also important because the 1930s are becoming an object of nostalgia for certain politicians of the right, and Mr. Trump happens to be one of those. So it's useful to recall what the 1930s actually were like. Beyond that, it's writers who experienced the 1930s, like Victor Klemperer or Hannah Arendt in Germany, who've left behind the legacy of wisdom from which the book draws.
You said in your lecture at the university that we are living in a historical moment. Is this the moment we're living in history? Is it more historical than any other moment in history? Are we at crossroads?
I think we are. But what I mean by a historical moment is something like this. Certain kinds of politics can cast a spell. We can think progress is inevitable, for example. If you're an American and you grew up in the 1990s, you were told there's no alternative to liberalism and democracy. And that means really there's no history. If there's more of the same, and the more of the same is coming, regardless of what you do or I do, that means you don't really have to understand history. That story of progress is now collapsing before our eyes. And I mean we're in a historical moment because the spell has been broken. People have to make decisions about what they're going to do, and yes, those decisions matter more now than they might in other times. And history is also there to give us a sense of what decisions we can make, what patterns we can recognize, and how what we do matters.
So in this book you're saying that people have to get more engaged?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the first America is a very divided country politically, like other countries, like Italy, like France, like Poland. We have almost two political nations. And when Mr. Trump won, the reaction of his opponents was to agree that this was a terrible thing. But that's not enough. One has to translate conviction into action. Mr. Trump is an exceptional figure in that he doesn't accept the rules of the game. And so people who do think that the rules of the game, by which I mean the rule of law, for example, or democracy or civil rights, people who do believe in those rules or in those institutions have to now do something. So the book is precisely, it's not a history book, it's a political pamphlet, it's a guide to action.
So what are the warning signs?
Well, the warning signs in a figure like Mr. Trump are pretty straightforward. For one thing, the way he behaves in rallies when he's in front of people very much recalls the fascist style of the 1930s. The call and response to the audience, the asking the audience to criticize the media, having the audience remove elements of the audience who are defined as outsiders. Mr. Trump's attitude towards the truth, the attempt to completely destroy factuality by lying all of the time and then saying that it's precisely the journalists who are the liars, that recalls every form of authoritarianism. Now, that's the leader, but there's also us. America has problems which make this kind of leader more likely. That the master problem would be economic inequality.
But then we also have the rise of illiberalism or authoritarianism in, of course, Russia, in Turkey, and in some parts of Europe as well.
No, so I come to this whole issue as a European historian and as an American who knows European languages and who has spent much of his adult life in Europe. What I'm trying to do is provide Americans with guidance that I get from Europe, from the 1930s, as you say, but also from the 21st century. Because much of what seems new and shocking to Americans has already happened in Russia or in Ukraine or in Poland or in Hungary or in some other place. So it's my deep conviction that we are in fact all in this together, that the processes that are underway are taking place in Europe and the US and Russia simultaneously. And so we have to learn from one another.
It seems like politicians like, well, Putin and Erdogan, they can say pretty much what they like. Nobody's really fact-checking them in a way that matters.
It goes beyond that. I think Vladimir Putin in particular is a kind of pioneer of the politics of post-factuality, where it's not that so much that you lie, it's that you don't acknowledge the difference between lies and truth. But with the help of media, which in Russia is state-controlled, you create a general state of confusion and therefore cynicism, where everybody is cynical about everything all the time. And interestingly, that creates nationalism, because if you think everybody lies all the time, then you don't trust the American media, you don't trust the British media, you don't trust the Icelandic media. You just think everyone lies. And if everyone lies, then it's better to accept your own lies than somebody else's. And that's where one ends up.
But there's also a breeding ground for this. And the breeding ground is rising inequality, discontentment with globalization, insecurity about jobs, immigration, of course. And immigration has become linked with terrorism in a way. So there's the ground is kind of fertile.
I would single out two factors. The first is the way the media has evolved. So as media becomes less personal, I think consumers of media become more vulnerable. In my country, at least, the death of local news prepares the way for the rise of fake news, because people stop thinking about journalists as human beings who follow facts and start to think of the media as something distant from some faraway city. And once it becomes abstract, it's easier for it to become fictional. And that's happened in both Russia and the US. One of the many things Russia and the US have in common is the absence of local news. The other thing I agree about is inequality. If you don't think that you can do better in your own lifetime, then you stop to care about the facts, the knowledge that might help you to do better, and you become more vulnerable to myths, like, for example, the idea of making America great again, which was Mr. Trump's campaign slogan.
But of course, the inequality in Russia is mind-boggling, really. But you see the US going down the same track, really.
This is a really important point. So it's very easy for Americans to say, and they're correct to say it, that Mr. Trump was a Russian candidate who ran a Russian campaign and had material help from Russia. He's also a very Russian figure in the sense that he's connected with Russian patron-client relationships, and his business career depended upon Russian money. That's all true. On the other hand, the thing that we need to be concerned about for our future is that what you say about Russia is also true about the United States. The degree of inequality in the United States is staggering. And if you look at charts, really Russia and the United States are together, all by themselves, very much different from other countries in Europe.
But it's also, and there's also the issue of immigration, because, well, Trump is talking all the time about immigration. Viktor Orban in Hungary is mostly about immigration, right?
Well, I mean, there's a specific East European phenomenon in, say, Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, where people talk about immigration, although there is no immigration, which I find intellectually interesting. So the refugee question is politically extremely meaningful in these countries, but they're not taking any refugees.
So it's not a problem in any way?
Yeah,
no.
I mean, it's a problem which is generated by the political class for its own purposes. So to say that there's a refugee problem in Poland or in Russia is absurd, because those countries don't, in fact, take any refugees.
No. But in the U.S., it's become a question of us against them.
I mean, that's
the racial. We see Charlottesville, which was kind of a shock to most of us, and It's about racial tensions and racism.
Well, it's about a president who is a racist and a president who sends very clear signals to that part of his base that it's appropriate for them to behave that way. When you have a president of the United States who says that Nazis are just one side and there's another side, that's clearly a signal to white supremacists that they're doing the right thing, and that's how they received it. But one simply cannot say that the presence of African Americans in our country is a question of immigration. These are the descendants of slaves who came over 300 years ago. And if we can't work them into our national story, that's our problem that we need to work on.
But do you think that conservatives in America can resist Trump? Where is conservatism going under Trump?
That's a very good question. Conservatism is dead, unfortunately. So what's happened is that basically every Republican who was a conservative has either left the party or expressed their opposition to Mr. Trump in a different way. It turns out that those people, although intellectually interesting, are not that politically important. The Republican Party is now a party which has an oligarchical component and which has a reactionary component, but it's very hard to find true conservatives inside the Republican Party. And I think in that sense, that's the tragedy of American politics, is that you don't actually have anybody representing conservatism, which is an important and legitimate position.
But has the system been able to halt Trump or stop him in any way? Well, one of the beliefs is that, well, the American institutions would be so strong that they actually could save us from this regime.
So Mr. Trump is somebody who doesn't believe in the institutions. That's where we have to begin. Mr. Trump is someone who characterologically is going to push up against the walls of the institutions until he finds a weak spot. He's going to keep trying to do that. So then what are the institutions? The institutions aren't real structures. They're other human beings. And so how strong the institutions have been has largely been a function of how much Americans have pushed them. So the investigation of Mr. Trump for his connections with Russia is a result of investigative reporting. If not for American action, you won't have this investigation. So yes, the institutions are constraining him, but I would say that the way that they're constraining him is itself a sign of concern. We don't have the system that we're supposed to have where the legislature constrains the executive. Congress is not constraining the executive very much. The judiciary is constraining him, but it's under constant threat. What's actually constraining Mr. Trump, as far as one can tell, is the FBI and retired generals, which is not the way the system is supposed to work, right? We're basically counting on the spies to constrain the generals, to constrain the oligarchs, to constrain Mr. Trump, which might work, but it's not what democracy looks like.
We haven't mentioned the word fascism or Nazism, but really the beginning of Hitler's real takeover in Germany was the Reichstag fire. A Reichstag incident, would that be possible in America?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Reichstag fire is a very important example, I think, for modern tyrants everywhere, because what the Reichstag fire teaches is that you can take advantage of a surprise, take advantage of an unexpected emergency.
Might be a terrorist attack.
Yeah, terrorist attack. The Reichstag fire was a terrorist attack. You take advantage of a terrorist attack to change the system. You declare a state of emergency, which is temporary but becomes permanent. That's how the Weimar Republic becomes what we call the Third Reich, essentially. That's how the Republic dies and the Third Reich begins. That's how Hitler becomes an exceptional leader. That state of emergency lasts until 1945. This sort of thing, unfortunately, is possible pretty much everywhere. And I'm afraid it's more vulnerable, it's more possible under a president like Mr. Trump, because first of all, he has no political ethics whatsoever which would stop it. And secondly, he has no policies of any kind which would actually attract support to him or his party in a normal way. They literally have nothing to offer. So and when you have nothing positive to offer, what you might offer instead is the emergency. Right? Whether you generate it yourself, whether you get it by chance, who knows? But the emergency which says we have to consolidate, we can't accept opposition right now. Unfortunately, I think that sort of thing would be very tempting for the characters who are now in the White House.
A bomb on North Korea?
I think there's a reason why Mr. Trump finds it so interesting to talk about foreign affairs. He doesn't know anything about them. And ironically, he's made the United States a much weaker country abroad. I mean, this is something that his supporters do not understand, that our diplomats matter much more than our army. And Mr. Trump has defunded the State Department and basically disempowered our diplomats. So America as a power is receding from the world very rapidly, as of course one feels every day in Europe. But he likes to talk about foreign affairs because you can project fantasies about how a bomb here or there will make a huge difference. I think some kind of disaster in foreign affairs would probably be good for Mr. Trump, because unlike disasters in domestic policy, he can then talk about how he's doing something about it. If a storm strikes Texas, or if a storm strikes Florida, as is happening now, Mr. Trump's whole position that climate change isn't happening and government can't help seems a little bit ridiculous. But if there's a crisis far away, he can always pose and strut, which is what he likes to do.
What about Putin? Of course, you're a specialist in East European history, East European politics, and you spend a lot of time in Eastern Europe. And well, Putin, he's ex-KGB. He's definitely not a communist. Well, is he a fascist, or how would you define Putin as a leader, as a politician?
I think Putin is a very intelligent man who has found a way to apply ideology to the state of affairs that he has created. The state of affairs that he has created is a kleptocracy, where a very small number of people control a huge amount of the wealth, and, this is important, they control the wealth thanks to the state, which means that reform in Russia is basically impossible. It's unspeakable. The result of this is that you need some kind of right-wing ideology which declares that politics is not about social advancement or reform. Politics is about virtue, or it's about sexuality, it's about the decadent West. Mr. Putin, since 2012, has brought back such an ideology with great success. He's convinced many Russians that the West is out to get Russia, and therefore Russia is in a constant state of threat. So Mr. Putin has pioneered a politics of oligarchy with, let's say, just enough fascism. Not enough fascism to get people out in the streets, but enough fascism to convince people that they really are special and that the world really is out to get them. That's a political style which Mr. Trump clearly admires. He expresses his admiration for it.
But then Putin is meddling in all sorts of things. He's meddling in European affairs. Some say he might even be meddling in the German elections.
Of course.
And of course the American and Brexit and whatever.
No, of course they are, but that's a logical consequence of their domestic politics. The domestic politics of Russia is to say reform is impossible, democracy is fake, markets don't really work, institutions are a scam, law is just ruled by the strongest. And you can convince people that that's normal if you can overwhelm them with media. Right? However, the problem is there are other places, like the European Union, where everybody is richer and everybody is freer than in Russia. So if your policy in Russia is to say, Russia is normal, no other place is better, your foreign policy has to be to take apart other places. So if Ukraine decides it wants to become closer to Europe, you invade Ukraine. If the European Union provides a positive example for Russians, an aspiration for Russians, you have to try to take apart the European Union, which is what's happened. That's what Russia's policy is. But it proceeds logically from Russia's domestic policy. From their point of view, it makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is if you're an American or European to deny that this is happening. You have to confront it and decide what you're going to do about it.
Hungary is warming up to Putin. Hungary is having has its own agenda. Well, the Polish can't warm up to Putin. That's not in their that's not in their psyche to warm up to Russia.
I wish it were that simple. So, I mean, Russia doesn't need Poland or any country to love Russia. Americans don't love Russia, but Russia nevertheless elected our president. Poles don't love Russia, but nevertheless you have a Polish Minister of Defense, Antoni Macierewicz, who seems to have very strong connections to Russia. To what extent he understands them or not is unclear. But and you also have a Polish cultural policy of proclaiming the exceptional character of Polish history, which is looking, unfortunately, more and more like Russian cultural policy. And so the irony of the present Polish situation is, of course, they're going to say we're afraid of Russia, but it doesn't matter what you feel. What matters is the structures you create, and there things aren't looking so good.
Is the European Union too tolerant of Poland and Hungary?
Well, I think the European Union faces a choice. I think it's possible for the European Union to exist with one Hungary, but probably not with 2 or with 3 or with 4 Hungaries inside. And so I think Poland has much more power than the Poles themselves realize. I think the Polish leadership thinks we can more or less do whatever we want, and we'll continue to get the subsidies from the European Union. Whereas I think in Berlin and Paris, people are already starting to think in a different way.
To end this, well, you've written a lot of interesting books, Bloodlands, and then you wrote a book with the late Tony Judt, a great historian. Well, when we were young, the words seemed to be kind of simple. It was the Cold War, it was us against them, and now this all seems to be so tremendously complicated.
Well, I guess the main lesson is history never ends. So when the Cold War came to an end, many people, especially Americans, said, history is over, liberal democracy has won, there are no alternatives. But when you say that, you're making a choice in history, you're creating consequences. And it turns out we didn't win the Cold War in lots of meaningful ways. America is not a richer country now for most people than it was 25 years ago. Without competition with the Soviet Union, our welfare state is eroding and is being taken away from us. So history doesn't end. I mean, what happens depends upon choices that people make. And I think what's now in 2017, after the election of Mr. Trump, a lot of Americans are belatedly realizing that and starting slowly to make their own history, which is encouraging.
Yes. And this is your book. It's being translated into so many languages, isn't it?
More than 30, not just in Europe, but also in Asia and around the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
On tyranny. Great having you here, Timothy Snyder.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Þátturinn er búinn í dag. Ég þakka ykkur fyrir að horfa.